Wir haben jetzt hier eine weitere Keynote, auf die ich mich sehr freue. Jake Schneider aus Berlin erzählt, welche Argumente es eigentlich gibt für eine mehrsprachige Literatur und wie es da aussieht mit den Förderungen. Also ein Thema, was sehr, sehr wichtig ist, wenn wir dieses Festival eben für die mehrsprachige Literaturlandschaft begreifen. Danke, Jake, dass du da bist.
Die Corona fragen, ob man mit Maske redet, aber alle anderen haben Masken an. Okay, vielen, vielen Dank für die Einladung und ich freue mich. Das wird jetzt auf Englisch sein, aber es gibt Untertitel. So. What is German literature? The question sounds simple enough, but it calls attention to some fundamental ambiguities. For one thing, the adjective German has two different entangled meanings, related to the German language and related to the country of Germany. To be sure, most books published in Germany are written in German. But before we can answer our first question, what is German literature, we'll have to decide whether the word German in German literature is referring to the language, the country, or the author. To help us untangle this, let's consider Austrian literature instead for a second, since the word Austrian only refers to a country or nationality. Okay, everyone, by a show of hands, would you call an Austrian novel written in German literature? Raise your hand if you'd say yes. Is an Austrian novel German literature? Okay, I can't see very well from up here, but I see a few hands. All right. Please put your hands down and raise your hand if you'd say no, that an Austrian novel in German is not German literature. Okay, I also see a couple hands, and a lot of people haven't chosen. That's okay. Thank you. For the sake of discussion, I'd like to introduce the example of Yiddish, a close relative of German that first emerged in the Rhineland in the Middle Ages, was spoken by about 11 million people throughout Central and Eastern Europe before the Second World War, and today has just a few thousand active speakers in places like Antwerp, Buenos Aires, Jerusalem, London, Melbourne, and New York. And actually, I should say it has about 600,000, according to one estimate. Yiddish was also the native language of most of my own ancestors since the Middle Ages, so I personally grew up speaking English, the national language of my birthplace. Yiddish itself has never been the national language of any country, but thousands of literary works have been published in it, and a Yiddish author has won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Okay, I'll say that last part again in Yiddish, just to give you a little taste of the language. Jiddisch ist euchlich gewesen, die Mama-Loschen von dem Rol von meiner eigenen Ureltern sind die Jemei Habeneim. Chotsch ich allein bin aufgewachsen redendig Englisch, was ist die Landsprache in meinem Gebäudenort. Jiddisch Gufe ist keinmal nicht gewesen die Landsprache von kein Land, nur man hat publiziert tausende literarische Werke auf ihm und man hat prämiert einen Jiddisch-Schreiber mit dem Nobelpreis für Literatur. In the 1920s, Berlin was a global center of Yiddish writing and publishing, with at least 12 local publishing houses in the language and even a specialized foundry right in the city that produced the elegant type for printing those books. It was also the original headquarters of the Jiddische Wissenschaftliche Institut, or YIVO, the leading organization for Yiddish language scholarship and philology. There was also a significant community in Austria. Okay, back to our scenarios. Let's say an Austrian writer living in Austria, everyone following? Austrian writer living in Austria wrote a novel in Yiddish. Would you consider that novel Austrian literature? Okay, who would say yes? I think I see one hand. Okay, two hands. I can't see very much. Okay, I see a bunch more hands. It's just blinding light. All right, and who would say it's not? So it's the Austrian writer living in Austria wrote a novel in Yiddish. Who says that's not Austrian literature? Anyone? Okay, I don't see anyone. Interesting. Okay, so this brings us to the question of the author's nationality. You might say an Austrian or German writer wouldn't write a novel in Yiddish, because if they did, they really weren't Austrian or German. I'll come back to that later. Hopefully you recognize the problem. I think even if it's the logical answer, and even if we decide that the adjective German is referring to the country of Germany as the place of writing, many of us will struggle to call that Yiddish novel German literature, or its author a, quote, German writer. I imagine the author would not have used those terms either, especially given the history that followed. The real problem is that these ideas of nationality and ethnicity and language are so tightly intertwined that these examples just aren't interchangeable. If, instead of Yiddish, I had chosen Swahili, another language spoken across countries, you might have thought differently, simply because the history of Jews in Germany is so specific, so tragic, and so uncomfortable for the non-Jewish Germans in the audience. Or if, instead of German, I had chosen English, the hegemonic language of multiple empires, the language of this talk, and the language that I publish in, you might think differently again. I wouldn't call a Yiddish book written in London English literature. You can justifiably argue that English language literature overall will do just fine without any special support from the taxpayers of Germany. I would remind you that English-speaking writers in different places are not interchangeable either. Still, because of the unique role of English internationally, I won't be focusing on it in this talk. My point here is to defend linguistic diversity, not to defend the dominance of English. Because of the unique role of English internationally, I will not be focusing on it in this talk. My point here is to defend linguistic diversity, not to defend the dominance of English. I am the editor-in-chief of a Berlin-based English-language literary journal called Sand, and we're about to release our 23rd issue after 11 years. I didn't start the journal myself. I inherited it from the previous editor-in-chief. And in fact, I will soon be passing it down to a new editor-in-chief once this next issue is released. Our city has a long history of publishing in many languages, not only German, and although there are gaps and discontinuities in this precarious environment, there isn't an unbroken chain of inheritance by any means. Publishers like me are not nearly as rare or as marginal as you would think. In my time, I have come across local magazines and presses that publish literature in Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, French, Macedonian, Hebrew, Italian, Arabic, and Norwegian, all in Berlin. The fact that we are neighbors enriches all of us and certainly sets us apart from our colleagues working in places where these are the majority languages. When I first started learning Yiddish, I tried to find out if there had ever been any Berlin-based Yiddish literary journals. And sure enough, I found Milgräum, which was published in the city in the early 1920s. I was astounded to learn that its offices were in the very same building where I worked when I first came to Berlin in 2012. Perhaps I worked in the very same room where they edited their issues. I should mention that all of these journals are precarious labors of love, and most of them do not last long. But that doesn't mean that they aren't important or valuable. Nearly a century after its publication, Milgräum was the subject of an extensive online retrospective that included, quote, translations of selected writing, along with commentary, criticism, and new scholarship exploring the wealth of material the journal published. Just 4 months ago, a series of YouTube videos was released, featuring original readings from Milgräum's pages. In general, that period of writing and publishing in Berlin has been viewed as an artistic and literary heyday in the history of Yiddish literature. Just in the last decade, it's been the subject of 2 academic monographs, an edited essay collection, multiple literary anthologies, a museum exhibition, and abundant literary historical interest. Who knows at any given moment which writers in which languages will leave an echo that lasts decades or even centuries? Will those exceptional writers all die in the countries where they were born? Maybe not. After all, we still remember Bertolt Brecht, Nelly Sachs, Thomas Mann, and Hannah Arendt, as well as Oscar Wilde, James Baldwin, and Gertrude Stein. Just from my own experiences in the Berlin literary scene over the past 10 years, I see our own time as parallel to that fertile period between the 2 world wars. This last decade in the city has witnessed an outpouring of writing and publishing in many languages, the likes of which I haven't encountered anywhere. You can see traces of this prolific linguistic and literary diversity on websites such as Literaturport and Stadtsprachen, at multilingual poetry readings such as Artichoke and Auslandssprachen, and in the profusion of multilingual readings and conferences that penetrated the heart of the city's literary establishment, from the Literarisches Kolloquium Berlin to the Literaturhaus. I should say that all this was before the pandemic, whose implications for the literary scene are still playing out. When these projects are publicly funded, however, it is worth noting that the people applying for and distributing that funding are usually native German speakers. Such applicants are more comfortable with the language of the application and can navigate the public funding landscape. Their grant proposals are correspondingly more likely to satisfy judges' expectations and priorities. As a result, in the cases when non-German language writing is publicly funded in Germany, it has typically been approved by several layers of ethnic German gatekeepers, and therefore the assumed audience has mostly also been native German speakers. It isn't acceptable here for linguistic minorities to be both the creators and consumers of culture. In Germany, that situation is labeled a parallel society, a Parallelgesellschaft, and it's seen as highly problematic, even if everyone involved speaks fluent German in other situations. As I see it, the real reason we resist the idea that writing in any language could be part of any country's literature has to do with our underlying assumptions about what a country should look like. Most of us still believe unquestioningly in 19th century ideals of nationalism, and especially here in Europe, the concept of the modern nation-state is bound up in the standardization and homogenization of official languages like High German to the exclusion of all others. In the case of Germany, the shared written language was the glue that united territories with many different local and regional histories, diverse spoken dialects, and two main competing religious groups. The effort to find common ground across a large territory went hand in hand with the drive to suppress linguistic diversity, especially in border regions, like this one, where the local vernacular was far from the standard, among long-standing ethnic minorities like the Jews and Sinti people, and among immigrants. Ali Eminov summarized this drive very well in a review of the essay collection Language and Nationalism in Europe. Quote, "Of the many secular ideologies that have moved people to political action during the last 2 centuries, nationalism has been the toughest survivor and remains widespread today. Nationalist movements aim to establish territorially bounded political units or states within which everyone would belong to a culturally homogeneous community or nation whose members would speak the same language. The premise of one state, one nation, and one language has been and remains the slogan of most nationalist discourse. In this discourse, the existence of multiple ethnic communities with disparate languages within a single state is seen as undesirable. The main role of a national language is to culturally homogenize the nation so that the state, nation, and language come to coincide with one another. Ever since the first nation-states emerged in Western Europe some 2 centuries ago, nationalist discourse has emphasized the central role of language in modern state formation. Moreover, the notion that a nation and a language mutually depend on one another has had and continues to have a powerful impact, not only in Europe, but also elsewhere in the modern world. All nation-states, some to a greater degree than others, are linguistically and culturally heterogeneous. If state, nation, and language are to correspond to one another, what is to be done with minority languages and their speakers? Nation-states have dealt with the status of minority languages and their speakers in various ways, ranging from maintaining the illusion of homogeneity by denying the existence of minority languages, trying to assimilate the speakers of minority languages into the majority culture and repressing their languages, trying to get rid of speakers of minority languages through population exchanges, expulsion, even genocide, or recognizing the existence of minority languages and granting the speakers of these languages certain linguistic and other cultural rights. This quotation sums up what I would call the ideology of the Sprachraum, which is German for language space, The idea that a language is a solid color on a map, and one language starts exactly where the other one ends, ideally on the very line between two homogeneous nation states. Of course, this vision does not match reality. Even in the case of German, we have seen that language border, quote unquote, shift significantly in recent history, not so far from Berlin. After the Second World War, the Allies moved the German-Polish border hundreds of kilometers westward, and millions of German speakers became refugees. Meanwhile, millions of Poles were forced to resettle into Poland's new territory from areas annexed by the Soviet Union. None of this was natural or inevitable, and indeed, the whole region was multilingual to begin with. Nevertheless, as Stephen Barber writes in that same book, Language and Nationalism in Europe, quote, "There is possibly no area in which language and national identity are more closely linked than in German-speaking Europe," unquote. The European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, which Germany has signed, guarantees certain rights, including the right to enjoy literature to establish minority languages. But it excludes migrant languages from that definition, migrant languages. Germany's recognized minority languages include varieties of Sorbian and Frisian, as well as Danish and Romani. Low German is a recognized regional language. Unfortunately, these aren't the languages in which literature is flourishing in Berlin. And indeed, almost all of these heritage languages only enjoy special status in certain other regions, which do not generally organize major literary programs in them. Sweden, by contrast, takes its minority languages very seriously and generously subsidizes publishing activities among other types of support. Today, Sweden is one of the only places in the world where new secular books in Yiddish are still being regularly published, thanks directly to government policy. A bit about the linguistic history of Berlin, with the important disclaimer that I'm not a historian or even an academic, and my perspective on the past is filtered through my own impressions of the present. Berlin's name is originally West Slavic, and the oldest Hebrew gravestone, the final resting place of a Berliner named Yonah ben Dan, dates to 1244, 7 years after the city's official founding. In the late 17th century, Berlin became home to a major community of French Huguenot refugees. In 1700, French speakers accounted for around a quarter of the city's population. For a while, it was even customary to address local letters in French. After taking the throne, the Prussian King Frederick the Great, Friedrich der Große, appointed the Berlin-born professor Jean-Henri Samuel Formey to publish a French-language literary journal, the Journal de Berlin. The Jewish community spoke a variety of Western Yiddish that faded out in the 19th century with the pressures of assimilation, but soon enough Eastern Yiddish speakers arrived, fleeing pogroms in the Russian Revolution, and brought their language with them, as I mentioned earlier. In the early 20th century, Yiddish plays were regularly performed within walking distance of Alexanderplatz. Those are just a few examples. In short, despite repeated ambitions to claim Berlin as the capital of a linguistically defined Germanness, the city has never been monolingual and never will be. Most cultural funding in Germany is organized at the state, Bundesland, or local levels, following the division of powers under Germany's constitution. However, the federal government does fund the arts indirectly through a series of national cultural funds that are organized as private associations. Basically, Parliament hands over its national cultural budget directly to these funds for each art form, which make their own decisions on how the money should be distributed. The fund for literature is called the Deutscher Literaturfonds, or German Literature Fund. As you might have noticed, our definition problem lies right there in the name. How is that ambiguous adjective German being used here in reference to the country, the language, the nationality, or some unspecified combination? Here's how the fund defines its scope on its website. Die Aufgabe des Deutschen Literaturfonds ist die Förderung der zeitgenössischen deutschsprachigen Literatur. The mission of the German Literary Fund is to support contemporary German language literature. As you can see, their charter defines the word German in German literature as referring to the language, although their funding comes from all taxpayers of Germany, the country, who speak many languages. Even Andrea Evels, secretary of the Gesellschaft für deutsche Sprache, the National Association for the German Language, the foremost institution for questions of German usage, was raised bilingual in Hungarian and German and graduated high school in Hebrew. Germany-based writers and projects in other languages are not eligible for funding from the Deutsche Literaturfonds, but the body does often support German language literature by Austrians, who have access to even more generous literary and publishing subsidies financed by Austria's taxpayers. As a result, literature in languages besides German is categorically excluded from federal public funding in Germany. Practically speaking, it is excluded from most other public funding as well. Our Yiddish writers or their modern-day equivalents must find some other way to pay the bills. And indeed, most immigrant writers who write in the national language of their birthplace no longer have access to whatever resources may have existed for them there. This is especially true for those who, like the German exile writers I listed earlier, have fled an authoritarian regime that practices censorship and punishes free speech, whether that regime is governed by the Nazis, the Soviets, or now the Taliban. Finally, most of them will continue to express themselves creatively in their native language for the rest of their lives, even if they're fluent in the national language of their new home and use it every day at work, when shopping, in the street, etc. Typically, it is the next generation that uses the national language creatively, and indeed this generation of immigrants has been very prolific in German language writing. There are a few exceptional cases of successful second language writers, for example, Sharon Dodua Otu, Tomer Gardi, or Isabel Cole. But for most of us immigrants, writing literature in our second language is barely an option. And, importantly, it defines our core target readership as the majority culture, in this case German. So, in practical terms, both native language literature by immigrants and literature in minority languages are structurally excluded from consideration. These writers are often officially ineligible for awards, fellowships, and writing residencies in both their chosen homes and their birthplaces, and may additionally have limited access to publishers and opportunities to promote their work. Publishers in the wrong country or the wrong language are likewise very precarious due to the logistical and financial challenges caused by their linguistic isolation. I say this as the editor-in-chief of a journal published in English, currently the most culturally dominant and prestigious language in Berlin, besides German, and indeed the world. If we struggle to publish literature in English, imagine the situation of Berliners creating and distributing literature in Yiddish or Kurdish. I should point out that these linguistic restrictions do not apply to any other art form, as far as I know. If a visual artist primarily uses words in their installations, they are not automatically excluded from federal funding if the words are not in German. As long as they have their permanent home, their dauerhafte Wohnsitz, in the country, they are eligible to apply. And indeed, the art scene is very international. Neither is there any rule against using federal funds to support performing arts in other languages. Just think of all the Italian operas performed in this country, their tickets heavily subsidized by taxpayers. For whatever reason, literature is the art form most closely associated with our ideas about the nation state. At this point, I would like to introduce the other concept from the title of this talk, Doikayt. In Yiddish, this word literally means hereness, and it had a very specific political meaning for Ashkenazi Jews in the early 20th century. Stretching it a bit and looking through my own retrospective prism, I could define this concept as making yourself at home or living in the here and now. For people who are writing and publishing literature, putting on plays, compiling dictionaries, and organizing cultural events in a language that wasn't official anywhere, being deliberately in the here and now meant living with their minority status in an environment of cultural and linguistic diversity. This contrasted with the Zionist dream of a Hebrew-speaking nation-state, and it also contrasted with the separatist nationalist movements of the larger ethnic groups in the places they lived, which had mostly been multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multilingual empires like Austro-Hungary and Tsarist Russia. Accepting their status as a permanent minority meant that Yiddish speakers would never come together as a majority in some utopian Yiddish land where their language was the national language with national borders and a Sprachraum to claim as its own. They would always exist alongside other official languages, which they would also speak in many situations. But the ethic of Doikayt also means that they wouldn't abandon their own culture either. They would actively build it. They would write books and perform plays in their native language in the places where they already were, and embrace the coexistence of multiple languages and cultures in the same country, even the same apartment building. Not parallel societies, but entangled ones. As the Yiddish expression goes, a Welt mit Weltlich, a world with many small worlds inside it. This idiom is used about connections that seem like coincidences, in a situation where you might say, it's a small world in English, or die Welt ist klein in German. For its part, Yiddish acknowledges that there are many small worlds all around us, all connected by invisible threads. That sense of connection and community across time and space makes us feel at home wherever we are. Fortunately, there are plenty of translators to help bring our small worlds closer together while giving writers space to express themselves directly to a readership who already understands them. Let's return to my question from the beginning. Should we consider a Yiddish novel by a German writer German literature? I would say yes. At the very least, it's certainly literature of Germany. But it's also Yiddish literature. And if that writer was born in Ukraine before naturalizing as a German citizen, it's also Ukrainian literature. We have to sit with these ambiguities, these hybridities, hyphenations, and overlaps. After all, the idea that the German language and German citizenship and the present-day borders of the Federal Republic of Germany are all the same thing is historical fiction. But the world as we know it is organized into countries, and I'm not saying we should abolish them. I'm saying we're here, now, and we speak and write and publish in many languages, and we're not going anywhere. Or, if some of us do go elsewhere, others will arrive, Doikayt. And after living in Germany all this time, I've come to appreciate what well-designed bureaucracy can accomplish when it sets out to address real problems, and to understand the crucial role of state support in the arts, which at its best can give artists from all social backgrounds the freedom and the time and the money to produce their art and still pay the rent. Because art is indispensable, but it is often not profitable. Now, after giving all that background, I do have some good news to share with you, which is actually why I was invited here today, to highlight Berlin as an example of what's possible. On the local level, given all the things I've told you about the visibility of our city's unique multilingual literary scene, and thanks to several generations of activists' hard work, there has been some progress. A few years ago, the Berlin Senate Department of Culture and Europe introduced a new program that is, I believe, the first of its kind in the world. Each year, 6 Berlin-based writers in any language would be chosen to receive a year-long stipend to work on their book projects, 2,000 euros per month, tax-free. The recipients so far, who all live in Berlin, are writers in Arabic, Croatian, English, French, Hebrew, Kurdish, Polish, Spanish, Turkish, and Vietnamese. The panel of judges that chooses them from the hundreds of applications is composed of literary translators who speak several languages each, and they rely on expert reports to decide on applications in further languages they don't speak themselves. They accept applications in any language. It's not a perfect process, but they have chosen a fantastic group of writers since 2018. I attended one of the showcase readings and was immensely impressed by each one of the fellows, including the ones I'd already encountered in my own literary Weltlich around the city. Separately, and also following sustained grassroots activism, in 2020, the Berlin Senate opened up its literary project funding to literary journals and did not require these publications to be in the German language. I'm proud to say that my own literary journal, Sand, was chosen for funding in that first round, and that for the very first time in 10 years, we were able to pay our contributors for their beautiful creative work, and even pay honorariums to ourselves, the more than a dozen people who choose the pieces, edit them, design the journal, and distribute it, a team that had been operating on a completely volunteer basis since 2009. That funding got us through the first year of the pandemic, when the events we used to organize as fundraisers would not have been possible. I'm sorry to say, though, that these two positive examples remain only examples for now. The Work Stipends program has been expanded from 6 people per year to 10, but to my knowledge, there are barely any other fellowships, residencies, or prizes in the whole country for writers who live in Germany and write in any language besides German. I have hopes that other cities will learn from this program. For example, Hamburg already has several publicly funded multilingual literary projects, exemplified by Found in Translation, the Hafenlesung, and this conference. But the overall paradigm that German literature must be written in German to be worthy of support remains firmly in place. The ideas and ideals of the Sprachraum are still mostly unquestioned. And meanwhile, SAN's public funding was not renewed after that first year, which meant that we had restructured our financial model prematurely and very quickly had to find other ways to support our project during the continued pandemic. We're still going, we're still living in Berlin, and we're still publishing writing from all around the world in the wrong language. As I pass this project over to my talented colleagues, it will continue into another generation. But in this process, we have learned that there is still plenty of work to be done. In order to make ourselves at home, to embrace Doikayt, and to be in the here and now, we as linguistic minorities need to acknowledge that these challenges will never be easy, and that the only way to achieve a world that celebrates all the little worlds inside it, for all their diversity and for all their languages, is to keep creating and publishing, no matter what happens, and to stop apologizing for who and where we are. We're all in the right country. And for the large majority who speaks German as a first language, truly learning the lessons of Germany's past means wholeheartedly accepting that diversity belongs where it is, in all its forms. Germany should not be imagining a purer, more homogeneous version of itself, nor should it be selectively supporting the country's culture on that basis. Doing justice to the diversity that's already here will mean giving cultural minorities a real say in our own cultural production, curation, and dissemination that reflects the very real taxes our communities pay in this country, even if many of us are not entitled to vote for the politicians who decide on cultural policy. And therefore, in this democracy, it is up to those who can vote and who grew up speaking German at home to recognize the value of our words, even when they are written in a language they may not understand. Thank you.